A government investigator walked into the Brazilian interior in 1967 and came back with 7,000 pages of horror, massacres carried out with dynamite, smallpox spread through donated clothing, children murdered in front of their parents. All of it committed by the very agency created to protect indigenous peoples. His name was Jada de Figueiredo Correia, a public prosecutor tasked by Brazil's Interior Minister Albuquerque Lima with investigating the Indian Protection Service, known by its Portuguese acronym SPI. What Figueiredo uncovered across months of interviews, field visits, and document review was not bureaucratic corruption. It was genocide administered through government paperwork. The SPI, founded in 1910 under the idealistic direction of Marshal Cândido Rondon, had rotted into an instrument of land seizure and ethnic annihilation, and its crimes stretched across the vast interior of the Amazon, touching dozens of indigenous nations who had no voice, no representation, and no recourse. But what makes this story unlike almost any other is not the crime itself. It is what happened to the evidence. Because the Figueiredo Report, all 7,000 pages of it, vanished, and for nearly half a century, everyone assumed it was gone forever. The SPI began as something remarkable. Marshal Cândido Rondon, himself of indigenous Bororo and Terena descent, founded the agency in 1910 with a motto that would become famous: die if necessary, but never kill. Rondon had spent years building telegraph lines through the Brazilian interior, making contact with isolated groups without violence. His agency was meant to be a shield, a government body that would manage contact between indigenous peoples and the expanding Brazilian frontier while defending native land rights. For a time, it worked, or at least it appeared to. The SPI established posts across the interior, placed agents in indigenous territories, and nominally represented indigenous interests before the federal government. But Rondon retired, budgets shrank, political priorities shifted, and the agents stationed at remote posts, far from any oversight, began to see themselves not as protectors, but as landlords. By the 1940s and 1950s, the SPI had become a vehicle for exactly the kind of exploitation it was designed to prevent. Agents leased indigenous land to ranchers. They sold timber rights. They pocketed the revenue, and when indigenous communities resisted, the agents had the authority and the isolation to respond with force. The transformation was not sudden. It was the slow rot of an institution left unsupervised in a place where no one was watching. In 1967, Interior Minister Albuquerque Lima had heard enough rumors. Reports of corruption and violence at SPI posts had been filtering into Brasilia for years, but the military government that had seized power in 1964 needed to project competence. A scandal this large could not simply be ignored. Lima appointed Figueiredo to lead an administrative inquiry. Figueiredo traveled to SPI posts across the Brazilian interior. What he found was systematic. At post after post, he documented the same patterns. Agents had been selling or leasing indigenous lands to cattle ranchers and logging companies. Revenue that was supposed to support indigenous communities was being diverted into personal accounts. Indigenous people were being used as forced labor on the very land that had been stolen from them. But the financial crimes were the least of it. Figueiredo documented massacres. In the Cinta Larga territory, in what is now Rondonia, attackers hired by land speculators flew over a village and dropped sticks of dynamite. Survivors were hunted on foot. A woman was hung upside down and cut in half. This was not war. It was pest control carried out to clear land for economic development. The report detailed biological warfare. Agents distributed clothing contaminated with smallpox to indigenous communities with no immunity and no access to medical care. The intent was extermination, and the method was efficient. Entire villages were wiped out. Sugar laced with arsenic was left as gifts. These were not rogue actions by individual criminals. They were patterns repeated across different regions, different SPI posts, different years. Figueiredo catalogued sexual violence, the kidnapping of indigenous children, and the systematic theft of indigenous artifacts and resources. He identified more than 100 crimes and named over 100 SPI agents as perpetrators. The report ran to 7,000 pages. It was, by any measure, one of the most thorough government investigations into crimes against indigenous peoples ever conducted in the Western Hemisphere, and its fate would prove almost as disturbing as what it contained. The Figueiredo Report was delivered to the Interior Ministry in 1967. Its immediate impact was real but limited. The SPI was dissolved and replaced by a new agency, FUNAI, the National Indian Foundation, in December of that year. Some agents were fired. A handful faced administrative proceedings. But Brazil was under military rule. The generals who controlled the government were not interested in a public reckoning with genocide. They were interested in developing the Amazon. Within a few years, the report became an inconvenience. Then it became a secret, and then, according to official accounts, it ceased to exist. In 1970, a fire at the Ministry of Agriculture destroyed the building where the report was stored. Government officials declared the Figueiredo Report lost, all 7,000 pages consumed by flame. The fire was suspicious, the timing was convenient, and for the next 4 decades, that was the end of the story. Researchers, journalists, and indigenous rights advocates who sought the report were told the same thing. It burned. There was nothing left to find. The most comprehensive record of state-sponsored genocide in Brazilian history had simply disappeared, or so everyone believed. In 2012, a researcher named Marcelo Zelic, vice president of the human rights organization Tortura Nunca Mais, was working in Brazil's Museu do Índio, the Museum of the Indian, when he came across references to documents that should not have existed. They led him to the National Archives in Brasilia, and there, sitting in boxes that apparently no one had opened in decades, were the 7,000 pages of the Figueiredo Report. The report had not burned. Whether through bureaucratic duplication, the foresight of an unknown clerk, or simple filing error, copies had survived in multiple locations. The 2013 rediscovery made international headlines. For the first time, the full scope of what Figueiredo had documented became available to researchers, journalists, and the Brazilian public. The contents were exactly as devastating as the fragments that had leaked decades earlier suggested. The testimony was specific. The names were there, perpetrators and victims both. The locations were documented. The methods were described in the dry, precise language of a government bureaucrat cataloging an institution's failures. Except the failures were mass murder. Here is where the story turns from tragedy to something harder to name. The Figueiredo Report was rediscovered. It was studied. It was reported on by international media. Brazil's National Truth Commission, established in 2012 to examine human rights abuses during the military dictatorship, drew on its findings. The Commission's 2014 final report concluded that at least 8,350 indigenous people were killed during the dictatorship, though the true number was likely far higher. None of this produced a single criminal conviction. Brazil's 1979 amnesty law, passed in the final years of military rule, shielded perpetrators of political crimes committed between 1961 and 1979. The Supreme Court upheld the law in 2010. Many of the agents Figueiredo had named were dead. Others were elderly and beyond practical prosecution. The institutional successor to the SPI, FUNAI, continued to operate, often underfunded, sometimes complicit in the same patterns of land encroachment the Figueiredo Report had documented half a century earlier. The indigenous communities that survived carried the memory in a different way. The Sinta Laga, the Waimiri Atroari, the Panará, these groups lost not just people, but languages, oral histories, ceremonial knowledge, and territorial integrity. What was taken from them could not be restored by a Truth Commission report, however thorough. The Figueiredo Report is one of the most detailed records of state violence against indigenous peoples ever compiled. It names names, it describes methods, it provides dates and locations. It survived a fire that was almost certainly set to destroy it. And after all of that, after the investigation, the rediscovery, the international attention, it changed almost nothing for the people whose suffering fills its pages. Brazil's indigenous communities continue to face land invasions, illegal mining, deforestation, and violence. FUNAI's budget has been repeatedly cut. The legal frameworks meant to protect indigenous territories are weakened by legislative maneuver and executive neglect. The Amazon, which indigenous peoples managed for millennia, is treated as a resource to be extracted rather than a homeland to be defended. Jada de Figueiredo Correa did his job. He went where he was sent, saw what was there, and wrote it down with the precision of a man who understood that evidence matters. 7,000 pages of evidence. And still, the distance between documentation and justice stretches on, unmeasured and unclosed. The report survives. The question is whether survival alone is enough, or whether a nation can read its own crimes in black and white and still choose to look away.